Test, test.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. For some reason, the camera's not working.
You want to uncut it or select it? Does your Mac still fit the camera?
Let's try the camera to
Look at it. So we try to turn it.
okay. Let's put that in there. Something else.
How did you look at this?
Oh, hang on a second. I fixed it for you. Are you sure? There's a shutter on the front of it, which was closed.
Oh, this works. Okay.
It's a weird place to have this.
Indeed.
Now, do you see film?
These are to do a last grab of me. Yeah.
Yeah, so if we could start to sit down, please.
Mark, are you into like a dance routine? Yeah, the headphone.
I am Madonna.
Wow, that's a date.
It does date me.
Beyonce, I think is what you mean.
But you got the reference, so you know.
It's true. I think I'm like very slightly.
It's upside down.
I don't know. How old are you these days? Huh?
53.
Oh my.
These days.
Yeah, so very slightly older.
Yeah, it's like.
Well, the number does change.
That's what I tell people is don't you have a reason why you can't just do like facial recognition. So that's what difference between plus one and facial minus one.
Right. Okay. All right. Let's get started. I hope everyone had a productive lunch. So lots of conversations, which is great. And we do seem to have our remote folks.
Thank you.
Good. Remember to sign into Meetup so that when we get to queuing, you can queue easily. I've asked Warren to take minutes for the afternoon. And he very kindly accepted with the proviso that he's very bad at it. So if folks could help him out, or if he could get someone to co-scribe with him, I think that would be really helpful. Which would take some of the road.
Yeah, I suck at that. So anybody who's willing to help, please do.
And thank you please for the morning minutes.
Sure. You can help? Fantastic. Okay, so before lunch, we had Ecker kind of present his very high-level issue, and I think there's an analogous issue, a set of issues from Krishna. And so let me try and get back to where we were on the screen. And that's not helpful.
You're recycling.
Okay, here we go. Recycling, okay. And so, Krishna, you opened a number of issues. How do you want to go about this? Do you want to focus on this one right here, or do you want to talk about your draft first? What will be your preference?
We can start with the vocabulary and then come to this. Either way is fine, please.
Do you want me to share the
Sure.
Can you stop sharing?
Oh, sure.
I think we're, is this on?
You must press the button.
It should be green.
Okay. I think we'll start with the vocabulary draft proposal that we had. In essence, what we felt was that the framework needed some approach on how we can provide more options for content creators and also make sure that there was some transparency and accountability in which the way we do this. So we proposed a set of vocabulary terms based on display preferences, essentially that dictate what happens when the content gets shown during various experiences. including search and other AI experiences. So the core of the proposal involves a few terms. One is called display text, which essentially allows or disallows the display of any identified text and associated reasoning with it. In essential, the way to think about it is display text is set to no. It would not show those parts of the text of the content of the document, and it will also not process the content of the document for any sort of like reasoning aspects. Associated with that is a display length category, which essentially sets up how much of any document content can be actually used for various experiences, including search, AI summarization, etc.
Sorry, Krishna, can you say what that reasoning thing again?
Say that again.
Can you say that reasoning thing
Yeah,
again?
display text essentially allows or disallows whether a content can be used for showing in search or AI experiences. And it also allows or disallows the processing of that content for various scenarios, right? So setting display text to yes essentially allows the content to be used, and if this display text to be no, essentially prohibits the content from being used. Display text length sets the number of units of the text. It can be words or characters, we can debate on it, tokens, whatever. We don't have much dogma on it, although words seem to be logical. The number of words that can be displayed from the content for AI or for generative scenarios. We also have a category called exact text match, which if set to exact text match is set to yes, this essentially means that you can use a document to produce a summary. However, the document needs to reproduce the exact content of the text that you are using. And it is also limited by the number of characters or words that you set in the display text length. So it's essentially make sure that if you look at the text that we have, it also says providing a backlink to the source would be one way of dealing with it. And so those, and we also have a generative AI category because it's a category that's well understood, I think, in the vocabulary right now. So that's the core of the proposal, essentially talking about how content gets used at the time of display or for processing that display. So.
Yeah, so any initial feedback to that, Leonard?
Yes, as I commented in email, I mean, this is a very good proposal if we were to extremely limit the use cases and for this work, which is, okay, let's think about this only for web-based, text-based content. This doesn't take into account other media types. It doesn't take into account scenarios other than the web. And so in my mind, while it's a very interesting proposal, I think it is way too small in scope to really address the vocabulary requirements as we are currently scoped and divided.
So if I can respond, I would like to push back on this. Nowhere in our proposal text do we say that this is exclusive to web or for online or anything like that. It just says search, AI, summaries, etc. All of the scenarios are included. I am not sure, maybe there's some clarity needed on this particular aspect in the draft that we submitted. However, we do not, and we didn't propose this as exclusive to web. Nowhere in the document is there any exclusivity mentioned.
No, but display, but it's really the, you know, in a sense, some of the use cases and considerations. In other words, if I wanted to apply this to an image or to a video that was not hosted on the web but was stored elsewhere, if I wanted to store this in, actually, and I'll use an example from your company, if I wanted to store this in an office, for example, that was incorporated in an offline collection of documents. I don't see how this would necessarily be applied, be relevant. In other words, it doesn't work. It makes sense when you talk about web pages. It doesn't make sense in the larger context of media, in my mind.
So we do have two other categories in there on images and videos as well. Leonard, if I'm hearing you right, you would like us to expand those categories?
Well, think about it. I mean, we can certainly look at it in that perspective, but that's, again, I don't want to dig in too deep at this level. You asked for, at the high level, these are my concerns with this proposal. I just don't, it's interesting, as I said, it's interesting, but I'm still not seeing how it works in the larger context.
So I'll just insert myself very briefly. Krishna, when I read your proposal, if I squinted at it just right, and I thought about it very abstractly, it felt like you were kind of taking things in a direction that is a little bit like Creative Commons, in that it's about, okay, you can use this data, but you can't modify it, or you can. You can use this data, but you have to do attribution, and kind of that level of controls. Is that kind of the overall?
Yeah, or not use it at all, right?
Right. Okay. But because I don't still want to overfixate on the specific, fine-grained controls that you provide as an example, if that's not, the whole focus. So next we have Brandon.
So a couple of questions, maybe just as a clarification one to start with what you say. It doesn't include user-initiated access of content. Does that include crawling that is user-initiated as a result of a search query? So fetching for RAG, for example, like in that context, does this cover that? Is that user-initiated, or is that considered to be part of what this preference would?
So if you're using a crawler to satisfy the user requests, then the crawler is bound by whatever conditions are posted or the preferences that are expressed. Sometimes the users will literally copy and paste a URL into a browser or into a mail or something like that. In those situations, it's just personal use that the browser is rendering, so we don't want to stop the browser from rendering.
Got it. All right. Can you maybe just walk me through so I understand a bit better, because this obviously goes to an issue that we've been trying to address, which is the distinction between, so-called traditional search and those types of controls and preferences versus the search results that are a summary or a synthesis or a composition of different elements. It seems to me like this reflects similarly, the existing situation where you have a choice between either, opting out of that by using the no snippet statement. In other words, but why don't you walk me through, rather than let me talk about my understanding, can you walk me through how, as a publisher, you would be able to say, I want to appear as an organic search link with a header, maybe a snippet, but no summary?
Yeah, so if you set display text to no, you still get the URL and the title. But none of the content of the document is used in any of the processing. Right? So it doesn't show a snippet, it doesn't create an AI summary or anything like that. Alternatively, you can set that to yes and say, I'm going to limit it to only 50 words. And both those preferences are layered, right? Or you can say, I want you to use it, but only exactly the text that I provide and nothing else. This is particularly useful if you have paywall content that you want to draw people to, that's part of the document, where you have one part of the document that you may want to expose, and then other parts of the document that you may want to hide. So it addresses all of those things.
So, Warren Kamari, I'm concerned that this is going to end up with some sort of weird incentive model where you end up with a lot of pages that are basically text in an image. and then the actual text that's in HTML or sort of readable is going to be web spam instead. You know, it'll be a good page about cooking recipes, but the actual only text will be car warranty ads or related cookie ads, but not the actual same text. And then I sort of, if I have to show something, then I'm going to use this text, even if it's not great. Maybe that's what ends up getting displayed because it's the only option. So sort of seems like potentially a way for people to increase web spam. And so, yes, you could choose just not to show any text at all, but if it's almost kind of sort of close, it might be better than.
Yeah, it's a really great point. Thank you for bringing that up. We obviously thought quite a lot about spam and junk and other sorts of abuse prevention when we thought through these categories. And in our head, if you are basically using these controls for display time preferences, you can still process spam and junk without the need of an exclusive broad category that basically blocks all AI use. So in our head, this was one of the reasons why we proposed it the way we did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know if it completely solves it because if I have to choose between not showing anything at all about the page or this exact piece of text, even if the text isn't quite perfect, it might be the only thing that I have available to me, and so I might choose to show it even though it's somewhat not optimal. But maybe I didn't word that well, so.
That makes sense.
Unless
Perverse incentives, as you said.
Yeah.
We had some mailing list discussion about no follow and just parsing the page for reasons other than indexing, I guess. I was wondering if you could comment on how your categories accommodate whatever no follow means to you.
Yeah, no follow essentially means that we don't follow a link through for indexing crawling purposes, right? I don't think we said anything about no follow in our document. Those tags that are currently honored will still continue to be honored.
Okay, but I guess to put the question another way, if I'm just parsing the page but not for indexing purposes, is there any way to express that preference?
If you're processing a page but not for indexing purposes?
Yes, this was the use case that was discussed on the mailing list.
Sorry, I didn't catch that particular use case, but if I were to think about it, if the preferences that we have right now essentially dictate the display of the content, right? So for spam junk processing, which is also one of the ways in which you might think of processing a document, we did not curtail those uses. Now, I don't think there's a demand for people to curtail the uses for these kinds of applications either.
Okay, thanks.
Elaine, you want to try talking, and if it doesn't work, I can relay your comment?
Sure. I wanted to get Krishna's thoughts on separating indexing and retrieval.
We're open to suggestions if we want to move forward, and if there are suggestions, we are happy to take a look at it.
Can you hear me?
yes.
Yep. So I had a particular question about the specific part of search and the distinction between classical search and the AI overviews that we see right now. So the question is really because okay, my understanding of the technology is that today these two technologies, at least in the back end, are extremely similar. So in this specific framework, would it be okay for I don't know, a search provider to train a model which only purpose is to serve classical search?
I need to understand more about what you mean by train a model. Because
So okay,
that's-
so most of the information retrieval algorithms right now work with transformer models, which is the same underlying technology as the generative models like GPT, Claude. So I mean, the thing that is happening in the backend is exactly the same thing. So most of the search providers right now, in order to provide what you call classical search with snippets, they have to do training that is very similar to the training of generative AI models. So as long as the application is just classical search, would this be okay?
Yeah, so in our proposal, we did not have a general AI training category. We just had a very specific Gen AI training category, which essentially blocks the training of generative AI content. However, if that category, if the generative AI category is blocked, then it cannot be used for training generative AI models, which is true even currently. However, if you are looking at specific examples of snippets or other things that might pop up, if display text is set to no, then essentially it's a manifestation of the fact that somebody is telling you they don't want to have a snippet generated either.
So by the okay, so just to be clear, by the snippet, you mean the little piece of text that appears like in classical search, Google, Bing, Yahoo, whatever, below the link.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Mics go. There we go. But no, you're gonna need that, man.
No,
You're the one person that needs it.
I'm done talking, man. You can have.
I think so. That's funny. So, I think this is like really, I think it's really helpful that like that you showed this. I think it's, I'm not sure it's accurate, but I think it's a useful intuition pump. I guess, there's been a bunch of questions that were the form of how would you say this with this particular vocabulary, right? And I think maybe we should step back from that question and try to make a list of things you might want to say, and then ask whether you can say them. So I think, be useful to, so when I hear people say, for instance, how do you say, do you want, you can use it for snippets, but not for an overview of the page. Is that something people think it is a desirable property of this system to say or not? My impression is that is one of the highest priority things that like sites want to say is, so like one of the things you hear sites say is, I want you to put something on your page which will cause people to go to my page as opposed to us not to go to my page. That's one of the core things people want, right? And so one way of expressing that is to say, is to find out a snippet of up to 5 words, but not. But I think it might be useful to like try to produce a list of like, the top 10 things that like approximately one wants to be able to say this vocabulary, and then look to see whether we actually can say, whether there's a test on how to be able to say them, rather than sort of trying to drill into, and I hate use cases documents, but I think unfortunately we kind of need something like that, rather than sort of trying to drill into, the vocabulary just yet, because, if we don't want to say something, there's no point in the vocabulary saying it. So I don't have that list. I could probably produce parts of it, but like, that would be my suggestion. And I guess we can start with the example I just gave, which is, do people think it's important to be able to say it's fine to include a small portion of this, but not to produce a summary?
And just to be clear, when you're talking about that, is that specific to AI, or is this really about just controlling search engines?
I think there's this is the thing I tried to say in my email. Unfortunately, there's a lot of like overlap between controlling search engines and AI. And this sort of this general practice of kind of like disintermediating the sites a lot has existed before AI. It used to look more like, we have like the Wikipedia thing, we have the info box that looked like this. So I don't know. That's another thing is, do people think they should be able to say, it's fine if you like do an info box, but it's not fine if you use an AI to generate the summary. I think that's, I don't understand quite why you say that, but, because my sense is what's happened is that the AI just made it easier to do it for everybody as opposed to custom code it. But yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at is exactly the question you're asking.
Right, because, yeah, for me, that goes back to the charter scope portion. Is this really the AI control working group?
That's an unfortunate problem, yes.
Holding
this for Christopher.
This one minute.
Okay, I'm just gonna hold this into the meeting.
Iker, can you turn off the mic? Oh, it's off.
Just to clarify one point, it looks like we're including an attachment mechanism as part of the vocabulary here. That's fine. I'm just trying to understand you mentioned the HTTP header and HTML tags. That's at the page level. That wouldn't be partial document or inline.
So we did not get into any of the attachment mechanisms at all on purpose with this document, because the logic being, let's get the vocabulary right before we get into the specific attachment mechanisms. But when we consider attachment mechanisms, page level, HTTP headers, all of them are fair game to consider. I think at the meta tag level, I think there's a different forum at which we have to take it up, which is W3C, I think. But page HTTP headers, I think we can deal with it as part of IETF.
I guess just the question is, I'm just thinking about instances where something's been at a paywall or login wall. Are you able to specify the vocabulary? Again, we're talking about how it's implemented attachment, right? So I don't know where you're going with this, but
we didn't get into any of the attachment mechanisms at all.
Sebastian Post. Maybe it's more like a question than a comment. So if I read that correctly, we are dealing with post-training. And what I thought was useful in the discussions in the past was to distinguish, to have a more structural approach, like a systemic, distinctions. Let's say we are dealing with pre-training or post-training, and the AI use category, which was more or less dealing with inference, RAG, fine-tuning maybe, would also be the categories that you suggest are like post-training categories in my understanding. So I don't know where we are in the discussion currently, because the AI use was like removed from the current discussed draft for some reasons, and now it's like it seems that this proposal is only about the post-training AI use. So I'm missing like a more general definition of where we are in the process and where it can be applied. So that would be required, and that would maybe be useful then to reintegrate it potentially in the discussion.
Yeah, so to be clear, we pulled it out of the draft, but we didn't say that it's out of scope for our discussions.
Yeah, so we did not get into whether this is post-training or pre-training or anything like that, from the simple perspective that me as an expert in this field, I sometimes have a problem distinguishing what is post and what is pre-training and all of that stuff, right? But pre-training, I can define them, but for a general layperson to actually understand those and apply them would be particularly hard. So we essentially kept it to purely display-based preferences, and we did include the Gen AI training category because that is a very simple category for people to understand. So we kept it in there, and also to keep continuity with the current draft, we kept it there. But we didn't get into whether this is purely post-training or purely pre-training or any of those scenarios, because that gets into too much of an academic space, which makes implementation super difficult for most of the people who are not necessarily AI experts. But happy to take suggestions on how to think through that in future versions.
Pepsi.
So Echo raised this question about the overviews or summaries or
the answer engine part of the search engine that we all know and love. And I wanted to dig in this one because I don't understand how your proposal works in that context. I think there are multiple pieces to this, and I can sort of see how some of them fit together. I can sort of see how you might say, no, I would prefer that you not. So if I imagine that one of these summaries is being generated by a generative AI, you might say, okay, so I'm going to opt out of the generative AI portion of this one, and I'm going to insist on only allowing indexing, because you have to allow indexing, and I want the exact text snippet piece that you put in here. So now you've got all those three pieces in place. How does that work if you imagine that the overview is being produced from a general LLM that hasn't been trained on your content, but is fed your content as part of its context?
Yeah, so that's exactly what display text does. So if you set display text to no, if your text is fed into this particular response workflow, that essentially will mean that that content cannot be used for generating the AI summary or the overview or whatever it is that you're working on. So essentially, display text does that.
Okay, so that's really an answer to Sebastian's point, which is you are, in a sense, making a statement about AI use that we had previously, except in a very particular way.
Yeah, it is a much narrower way and much more controlled way of
yeah.
this.
And this is, I think, where it comes the more interesting question is, and probably not something that you can answer, and it's a question for the room more than anything else, is do you think that someone who understands this in that context and is able to apply those preferences is applying preferences that will stand the test of time as the products evolve and change?
I mean, I hate to prognosticate about what might be the future. I'd be in a different profession if I did that, but I think it does for the most part, at least as far as I can see in the foreseeable future. But what happens downstream, like 10 years, 15 years from now, I mean, the pace at which this thing is going, I can't tell, and it's more of a question for people to think and address. I wouldn't be doing any service by making guesses on what it would look like 20 years from now.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that's something for everyone to think about.
Paul?
So thanks. I still have sort of problems fitting the overall proposal into the logic of the current draft, which may not be the intention, right? Or like, and secondly, also reconciling the proposal with the charter, right? Like, it seems to me that the charter drives at a number of things that are maybe partially addressed by keeping the generative AI training category in here, but like the use and processing of information is not really covered by this proposal because it focuses on display. And if I go back to my initial conversation, the vocabulary for me really like something which needs to act as the sort of Rosetta Stone between the different implementation mechanisms. The ones like, I think Leonard made the point early in this discussion that a number of the things are not very relevant in some of the other contexts that some of the other attachment mechanisms would work in. So I'm wondering how to reconcile that. And to me, it looks like almost that a number of the categories that you specify might be very useful as sort of additional arguments or additional flags together with something like a search category, because they mainly sort of apply to the search category. So and then the question is, where do we define those additional flags? And if they are relevant mainly in the web crawling and search context, it might make more sense to address these things in the actual attachment draft than in the vocabulary itself, because I think in the they make the vocabulary really hard to sort of make it useful in other contexts or parse, understand with other.
Yeah, perhaps you're right. Perhaps that is the flaw of the current draft, that it tries to be everything for everybody. And hence the heated debate that's happening, right? But that being said, what I will say is that we did not make our proposal just purely search specific. It is applicable to other scenarios. As to whether it should be expanded to, that is a conversation that we are happy to have. But I mean, I leave it at that.
So I had a couple of questions on specifically one on the generative AI and the other one on the snippets. But for the generative AI, I mean, from technical point of view, I actually support the idea of maybe whatever we come up with at some point. Probably is better to not differentiate between pre-training, fine-tuning, post-training, or reinforcement learning now, because the capabilities start moving. So for instance, right now, some of the, let's say, to give an example, the generative image, like the generative models for images, can do things in inference, so without any further training, that can adapt a certain style, and that is without any training. So my question with that example was about the specific category in generative AI training is, should probably, that said, should that be modified a little bit so that it includes cases where the model is not trained, so to cover these new capabilities that they don't need training of the model specifically. And by training, I mean this is actually something that is well defined. I mean the model changing its weight and biases, so the model changing in short.
Is it warning?
I get the question. They're turned down.
Okay. I have a question and then a comment. So at some point you said in an answer that like you took this Gen AI training category because it's clear, it makes sense. You took it from the other draft and that's fine. But that raised the question for me, what's actually the problem with the other draft for you? What's the problem you're trying to address with that? That's not super clear to me as no.
We did articulate it as part of the rationale for how we proposed it. The generative AI training category actually makes sense in some way because it is about the output that we are producing, right? So that was one of the rationales for why we kept it. I have multiple problems with the other draft, which we have filed in like a few issues and also articulated as part of the issue, the proposal for this particular draft. So I think there's an issue on introducing this draft that I find that articulates all of that.
And then my comment is, I think actually this point that Sebastian made about post and pre-processing, or also like Eka put it in the chat at some point. In some cases, we talk about how we get something from the web and feed it into the model, and in other cases, we talk about how we get it out of the model and then present it on the web, right? And these two different things are, I think there might be both cases in both of these categories, there might be use cases for people that they want one or the other thing, and they might overlap. And I feel like actually putting everything into one bucket and trying to define one terminology that covers all of that, that's where the confusion comes from. Because sometimes you can achieve a certain use case by either restricting what goes into the model or what comes out of the model. And you can do both, and then there's an overlap, and then it's like not clear anymore. Maybe it makes sense to kind of separate those two things and have different choices for different people to choose.
I hear your feedback. Happy to learn more about it. So.
Okay, and Felix.
Yeah, I wanna go back to the point that I think Martin raised about the display text category, because I also, just reading the category, did not understand that this category is intended to allow somebody to express, I don't want this to be used in an AI summary. But if it allows that, I think it would at least go a long way in addressing at least sort of the news publisher concern. But it would be useful maybe also regarding what Sebastian said about the AI use category to explain how it's different from the AI use category that we discarded. I think, or at least the way I understand it, is search operators and probably other companies as well, they might access something at inference time in order to decide whether to show it as a search result or not. So for example, I think Gary, when he did this presentation about how Google search works, he said, well, we might use AI to decide whether a web page is an error message or a genuine web page. So we have to access it at inference time to provide traditional search. But I guess the difference would be with the display text category is you're only blocked from doing inference time if you're then planning to use that content to inform what is being displayed, but it's not blocking all inference use, right?
Correct.
So I think that would be at least a very helpful substitute for the older AI use category that we had.
Yeah, we should probably consider making that clearer.
So at a super high level then, and I think Martin summarized this in the issue that you originally raised, you know, the big changes in your draft are removing the top level category, which I thought that's a separable discussion. Let's put a pin in that for the moment. And then kind of, you know, what we've talked about before is search and use transitioning to this purpose-based approach. And without getting into the details of what that looks like or what it applies to or what controls it offers, you know, I just have this kind of high level, you know, controlling reuse, controlling attribution, controlling modification, those very high level kind of concepts. Is that an interesting direction for folks? I'm trying to get a sense of the room of does this seem like it's more likely to end up a consensus for us? I'm wondering if we should do a poll at this point.
Sure.
Yeah.
And if you can turn the board a little bit, I'm trying to focus on it, but it's.
Good luck with that. Yeah, it's very murky looking. So let's try and formulate a poll.
Just one quick question.
Sure.
Is the main difference really that it's purpose-based, or are we also talking about something that is actually more fine-grained?
I think that comes with the territory. You know, and there is a question about how we achieve that granularity, whether we start with a couple of coarse-grained things and then iterate, or whether we ship a bunch of little fine-grained things and see how that goes, or there's the whole strategy to come up with that. But in terms of just how we think about these things, I think that's the question we need to solve first, if this is the promising direction we're going. But yeah, that's a great question. So and so we'll just call this the purpose-based approach for convenience.
Why are we calling it the purpose-based if it's about display-based proposal and not following the display?
So that's how you originally referred to that.
It's display-based.
Display. Okay, so you thought display-based.
Yeah.
I feel like that might be a little distracting. I'm not sure.
I think, like, to me, like, honestly, like, that display based shows that this is focusing on a very narrow subset of what the vocabulary is supposed to be about. And I also, like, I'm still not entirely sure, like, Amelia tried to get Krishnan to articulate what the key problem is, why it is necessary to replace the original approach with a display-based approach. And so, like, I heard you, and I know, like, the answers, but, like, I'm still missing, like, a very sort of clear articulation why we should essentially bend in the way that we've taken so far and replace it by something focusing on display.
And I think display-based makes sense if you're just talking about search, which I think is what you were doing. But I think we've heard a lot of interest in this kind of use cases.
That is where my reference to the charter comes in. Like, this is not a working group that has been chartered to address issues with new forms of web search. Like, read the charter again. It is chartered to discuss preferences expressed to the there's three things, like search is not in there, display is not in there, there's use in one thing, like I think it's the acquisition and processing or something. I think we are.
So I think this goes back to the discussion we had about the inference preference and use. In that, and Krishna, I'm going to give you my interpretation. I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether I'm on the right track or not. You know, as we said before, one of the things that came up in the discussion of inference time was that it's not terribly meaningful to say you can or cannot use AI as a technology with this content. Because you can view it as just a tool, just like a programming language or a data structure. And so it's a little nonsensical to say, don't use my content with linked lists, you know, for the computer science folks in the room. And I think what I'm hearing, there's a latent argument being made that kind of can be up leveled to everything here. That you know, saying, with the possible exception of training, which might be a special case. Is that kind of the line you're taking, Krishna?
Yeah, so the proposal, the reason why we did it is because the AI inference category or AI use category as it existed before was just overly broad. That blocked all kinds of processing based on AI, which would have been almost impossible to do even in search today, right? You couldn't rank something, you couldn't retrieve something. So our approach essentially took it to a little bit more focused way, where we say, hey, at the time of display or at the time of processing, if you have these kinds of scenarios where you want to show a piece of content or you want to summarize it, here's a potential way to do that, right? So I really disagree with the point that we just focus only on search. Actually, it applies more so to AI scenarios than anything else. With search currently being one of the primary AI scenarios out there. So I think it would be almost impossible to distinguish the current incarnation of search from AI and AI from search in so many different ways. Like ranking, for example, we show that. Our goal is not to block this from some document being ranked, but it's from having it shown, right? So hence our proposal.
So we had a blissful moment when the queue was empty, and now we've refilled it. Yeah. So let's do that, Chris. Is there a microphone here, Chris? Thank you.
Yeah, so I very much agree with Paul that we should be aiming, I think, to deliver a vocabulary that publishers can use. And the part that's unclear to me is the display text. Why the display text description, as you've just given it today, and as it's in the addendum? Like, why would that not serve as a good basis for, what we were calling RAG or grounding or inference time usage? I think you could take the current draft we have and integrate some of your language into that definition, and I think that may give us something that's useful. I have a concern that we're opening the door to sort of a lot of unknown potential use cases of the data. And so I think the publishers and creators still do need a way to be able to express whether they want their content to be used in conjunction with AI models on a sort of general basis. But I think the description that you put in, like, perhaps helps us move towards a more clearer definition that could go into the existing vocabulary draft.
Pedro.
Yeah, so maybe because, well, to be clear, I think I'm a little bit more in favor of the use or the display approach in this case. The main reason probably to address Paul's question on why the existing vocabulary doesn't really addresses. I mean, it doesn't really address the things that could be addressed with I use or displays vocabulary, is because I mean, I have seen us struggling for quite a long time on decoupling things. Let's say, for instance, general purpose AI and then generative AI, and then how does search work on that? Well, with all of those concepts. And I think a use case or display-based vocabulary would be far more usable, far more reliable in time, because it doesn't rely on the underlying technology. What is happening right now with, I mean, with the current vocabulary is that first, it is very difficult to define what AI really is. The concept, the concept that we have right now has become a very ubiquitous thing used in multiple products, in multiple programs across like all aspects of computer science, including search, but also other stuff. Well, that would be a very, very long list. So saying, okay, opt me out of AI training is starting to become more and more akin to saying to a programmer, I am opting out of for loops. You cannot use for loops if you're going to treat my content. So this is the problem that we are encountering right now. Like I don't think that that is technically that is technically maintainable in the long term. Whereas the use case is a little bit more even understandable, in my opinion, for the right holders, for the users, because if you talk about, I don't know, how you display the data, if you talk about I don't know, uses like translation, summarization, derivatives in terms of I don't know, appropriation of style, then I think that is a little bit more understandable, a little bit easier for users to get.
Others?
Just responding to what Paul was saying, I think there's a common thing that happens when we try to standardize something, which is like you have an initial sort of course concept of what you think is needed, and then in the process of talking about it for months and more people showing up, you find that there are like more granular concerns that people have that end up getting reflected in the ultimate finished product. And I think that's basically what has happened here. So I think the preferences that Krishna wrote down in his draft basically just reflect that. It's like a refinement on the discussion, and the fact that what we're talking about now isn't like an exact match of this what was like a very high level, set of 4 preferences in the other draft or in the original thinking. It just means like we're getting a more refined understanding of what the needs are of people who want to use and consume these preferences. And I think we've heard now repeatedly from all of the people who run search engines that like search and AI are inseparable, and AI is a technology that underlies all the different aspects of search. So I think like if you think these preferences are only useful for search, they're still in an AI context. I don't think that like puts them out of scope. So I really appreciate the effort to get more fine-grained with this display-based approach. As noted, like they're not all display-based because there's still this like training category in there. But I think if we don't attempt to address these use cases that many people have brought to the group, because we're somehow like committed to the original concept of there only being a couple of high-level categories, then for one, like we're not doing our job because we're not meeting the needs of the users, and 2, I do think there will be collateral damage, as Krishna has discussed.
Okay, Eric. Yeah, I wanted to sort of also on what Alyssa was saying there about process. the chart, I mean, first of all, I don't think the charter actually precludes Crystal's approach, but if it does, and we think it's the right approach, the right thing to do is fix the charter, not to be like, oh, we're just like, the decisions we made a year ago, knock us out. The approach of the charter is to serve the work of the working group, not to nail down one approach. But as I said, I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it would be a problem.
No, perfect. Not convenient.
So I think one thing about this approach that I really like is that we don't try to put it in this like AI, not AI category anymore. That was like initial thinking, and I think we all understood that that doesn't make sense and doesn't exist. So having something that is more generic than AI, because everything is AI, I think is a useful step. The other thing about this approach, I think it is more fine-grained. But it's also, I think it has a generally different approach because the old model was hierarchical. So it always tried to kind of cover the whole space, and you could fall back and you would like, if you don't define something, you can go like one level back and then you have like, that preference applies. And the new model is really kind of not trying to cover the whole space. It really looks at like specific cases, cover those that we know, that we understand that people want, and leaves like the rest of the space open. And I think that's a more useful way to go, because the space is moving all the time, and I think that allows us to actually define the things that we want to say and leave room for other things we want to say in future that we don't know yet.
Mark.
Yeah, I heard from Krishna that the intent here is not to fixate on search, but look at display. So it might be helpful to look at this in the context of something that we do understand reasonably well, I think, or at least some people do, which is code generation. And so a lot of people are using AI tools for code generation. How would a display-based preference and display text operate in that setting? And how would you, for instance, express a preference that your content not be used, for instance, verbatim or as part of one of those tools? So there's the Gen AI training, which I think is part of it, but I don't know that that's the only thing that's used necessarily in one of those tools. My understanding is most of those tools are basically just a generic model that takes the context, which is your program, and not a lot more than that. But that's not necessarily how they have to be built. And so if you imagine that there is a corpus of code out there that can be used and indexed in various ways and used to produce code, how would this fit?
It's a great question. I'm smiling because as a programmer and as an engineer, what I would do is if I have that much interest in just completely using another code, I would just use that as a library, not resort to generative AI to generate the text where it could probably be erroneous. That being said, it's a case where we have to think through, right? Like, so if in my head, if a model is being trained based on code, and that code basically says, hey, don't use this for model training, then you don't use it for model training. I don't know of models that verbatim reproduce code in a generative sense.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, they do. That's why I was laughing. Yeah, but not in the kind of like RAG-like scenario that we're doing. But anyway, in those cases, the exact match actually does apply. If you have an exact match associated with it, this means that if you're using that particular piece of code as an input for generation, the exact match would apply, or the display length would apply, display text would apply. So, but it's a good scenario for us to think through, and I'm happy to think through that with you.
Yeah, because the reason I ask is that there's this implication here that this is some portion of the use in that model, but it's only related to display, and I don't understand what display means in that context, right? And that's why I was asking, because I don't think it makes sense in this context to think of it that way, because as you rightly pointed out, if you wanted to copy the text, then there are other ways to do that that are much better as an engineer.
More efficient.
Right, and much more efficient. But so where is the display in that sort of scenario? Where is the display when it comes to, for for instance, an image generation application, and thinking about different other applications of these things, I'm struggling to come up with what is the display such that these things would apply.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to think through these with you, right? There's like probably this and many more scenarios that we've not talked through, right? We were trying to cover the ground for most of the scenarios that the content producers were really worried about. And part of what I think works for our proposal is the focus to make it actually work for preponderance of the community. But the code generation example is a good example for us to think through. And we can probably take that up offline and maybe demonstrate how that might work. Right?
Paul. I am wondering if we are if we're having two different discussions that go through each other, right? Like it seems to me, and to Alyssa's point, that yes, things like how we discuss things change, and this clearly is a much more granular way of expressing certain parts of the vocabulary draft that we had so far, which I think mainly play to the side of the two categories that have been the focus of our discussion since the very beginning. We started in Brussels saying we have these three other ones related to like the overarching one and the two training categories. And I think 90% of our time so far was spent talking on what at times was called AI use and search things. Those were from the beginning identified as the things that are probably hard to define. We had a very hard time to define them. One of them has disappeared in the current draft. And I think in your proposal, there's a number of good approaches to maybe make something that takes up some of the functionality that we had originally envisaged for this to reintegrate in the draft. But at the same time, like I think it might be useful. It might be useful for people to sort of also define what we already have agreement on. And to me, it's an interesting question. The one question that is raised by your proposal and also the email that was around it: do we still have that relatively rough starting agreement on that we have a separation, that we have a relatively clear conceptual separation between pre and post training, or sort of like around the training stage, so AI training categories and other things? Do we still have that, or has that disappeared? And what do we do with the top level category? Like I feel we could potentially have a much more productive discussion about this proposal and how it fits into the rest of the discussion if we solve those two questions first.
Good. Chris. Yeah, I guess this is maybe more of a point of detail rather than a high level question. Like, I think, the language that's used for display text, says the content can be used as a direct input to generate an AI experience. I think we would need to broaden the scope. It's not just about text. I think you have categories there for video content, for example. Like, we would want to be able to express those kind of preferences for audio and video and imagery, because this addresses, for example, the use case that Leonard has raised before around style transfer. It addresses use cases around impersonation or sort of reuses of someone's likeness against their wishes. So I think adding those kind of caveats around the audio, or sorry, the video, and extending it towards really all forms of content and not just text, I think would be a help as well.
Okay. You're throwing the queue again.
My computer died, so I can't.
Oh, okay. We get mic over?
Just want to say that I think there's some good things in here, though, and thinking about the use category that we couldn't find consensus on, that there's, I think there's an opportunity here for a draft. So I don't think it should be a replacement for the other drafts, but I think there's things that we can work with there.
Well, and I guess, at a high level, is this kind of approach a replacement for what we're currently calling the search and use terms, I guess is the question. And I did think it's worth keeping in mind that originally, we added the search term not to try and have control over search. It was put in there to give people the assurance that if they said no training, that wouldn't accidentally turn the search off. It was a carve out. And we had this discussion before in Brussels that yes, we knew there was a strong desire to have control over things like summaries and so forth, but we weren't going to address that yet. We just wanted this carve out to give people the confidence to use the other mechanism. That's not binding, of course, but that's the context of the search term. And so another direction we could take would be to go back to the original intent and reformulate it so it's more clearly carved out and not a control mechanism. Yes.
Yeah, that was a bit how I understood the proposal to provide better definition for the categories. So instead of replacing like a hierarchical model, it would allow you to provide maybe examples for higher level categories for users to understand what that means. So that you could say, okay, I don't want that specifically. I can find that in the search category. So I would not opt out of search because it would affect the way how the content is accessible. So I think we are with that we would do by replacing, we would do the second step before the first. And the initial kind of response from creators and rights holders, I can tell you, is there a way to opt out of everything? Like, is there like the main plug at this point when you are getting into the details and you require for such a granularity to be decided upon? That is a danger, I would say. While it should, the hierarchy makes sense in a certain way.
Right. I guess, trying to synthesize the discussion since then, part of the nuance is that, when they have pulled the main plug in mind, me as a website operator, I have something specific in mind, which is I don't want them feeding that into their training of a general model, or I don't want them to put that in a search experience. And what we've heard is that, AI is such a potentially prevalent technology, whether that's good or not for society is somebody else's discussion, not in this room, that's kind of problematic because it's such a wide-ranging statement. That's the feedback that we've heard. Felix.
This is more of a meta comment, but I get the impression we're struggling a bit right now because we're trying to discuss all of these elements of the proposal at the same time. Like some of us are discussing, is the display text category possibly a good replacement for the AI use category? How would it need to change? Like, for example, do we need to bring in other modalities than just text? Other people are discussing, should we get rid of the top level category? Yet other people are discussing, does the distinction between training, pre and post training make sense? I feel it might be more productive to pick one, like for example, to try to work on the display text category and see if we can find something that we can all agree on that addresses kind of this AI summary issue that seems to be a pressing concern for a lot of people, and then maybe come back to the other questions after that, because otherwise I feel like we're not really going to move forward.
Yeah, we've been trying to steer the discussion, but because these parts of this are intertwined, it inevitably comes up. From my standpoint, I'm trying to focus mostly on this search use stuff, and I think maybe after the break we might talk about the top level category a bit more, because that's been brought up by a few people as well, and we'll have a few votes on that too.
So in that case, I mean, I do think, because I think Paul asked, or somebody asked the question, is this supposed to be a replacement for the search category that is currently in there? I feel like there are already more fine-grained controls for search in use in search engines today than the search category that we had in the draft. So in a way, we would be doing a disservice to people who have been using these categories like no snippet and so on if we don't have them in there. So in that respect, I find it makes sense to have them in there if we're going to address search, and it seems like we might have to. But where I think more discussion needs to be had is in the AI summary case, which is why I find the sort of display text and exact text match category so interesting. So I think maybe it would be interesting to explore, can this be applied to other modalities like images, for example? Can you say display image or even have a generic display category that says you cannot use this to inform the output of the AI summary, but you can still analyze it or something.
Harry.
Reaction to Sebastian. You said that people just want to opt out in general, but my experience with small publishers is that if you start poking them for more granular stuff, then you get other stuff out of them. Like they just don't like AI. That might be one thing. They don't like the platform. Someone said it here. That might be another thing. But then there could be also very technical things that they don't like the generative AI display, for example, or whatever. And that's why I thought that Erin's comment was very interesting. That why can't we run a study and see what actually people want?
There you go.
Yeah, I also wanted to comment on this like simplest switch. I mean, of course we just want like something simple, but it also should work, right? And like accepting the idea that there is not this like a word without AI and the word with AI. The only way you can switch it off, say disallow, and you don't give access to your content at all. Because like having actually saying AI no, but search yes doesn't make sense anymore. That's an empty set.
Yeah.
And if we accept that, there is no simple switch.
Sebastian.
Maybe responding to what Gary said and with regards to the search category. So in my understanding, the search category is meant to be in place to avoid that creators have to choose between preferences with regards to AI, be it pre-training or post-training, and being found on the web. In any case, I'm not like I have not done that study, but I would assume that the search category will most likely be switched on because that is an interest of creators and rights holders to be found using any available means that there are. So like, be it like AI supported search or whatever. So I think when you are being too granular in that case, you incentivize maybe people to switch it off where they would have preferred to switch it on by being too granular. That was my point of it. Like not in the way like, okay, can we kind of have a power switch for switching everything off, but also like can we simply say, okay, we want to be found, but we don't want AI to train or to use it in a certain way.
Yeah, I think somewhere along the lines, right? I think one of the things we discussed is like if you have a lot of small, very specific things, unless we have some kind of structure that has like a more general thing than that, it's not going to work pretty well for people who are going to use it, right? And so if you're going towards something that's flat and not hierarchical, then this doesn't work. So I think that's kind of where we're getting stuck at the issues, is because like in this one direction to pull, which share the reasons, like why. Like we need to have a flat structure, which kind of doing things. Another thing is like, like everyone's bringing up, right? Like maybe there's like a bunch of reasons people exactly know what to do, but they don't know how to generalize it. And this tension is like very hard to resolve, right? Because like one of them is to kind of make sure that we don't unnecessarily block more than what we need to. But unless there's a hierarchy, people cannot go either the coarse grain or a fine grain. I think that's
part of the issue I see. Warren. So Warren Murray, I mean, you turned it off. So Gary's original thing of, can we run some sort of study or survey? I'm concerned that it will be very hard to do anything like that because you could reach some set of publishers, but you're not going to reach my auntie and you're not going to reach me and you're not going to get a bunch of small people who don't really. Yeah, well, if you do reach me, well, if you reach my auntie, she will have no idea what you're talking about. And I don't know if we can really get that's peaceful. Possibly. But my sort of meta comment is we've been here quite a while and we're getting low on time. And I'm not entirely sure that we're getting closer to any sort of consensus and outcome. It feels like we're sort of going in circles. I don't know what to do about that. Just how do we move it from where we are now to some better views? Who wants the mic? Aaron. Oh. On our side,
Although, if you guys want to address that.
No, please go.
So the discussion a few people ago was about the appropriate level of granularity. And that's actually one place where I think the attachment mechanism could come into play in a substantive way. Because if you are able to state a preference addressed to a particular crawler, then you can be making those fine distinctions among kind of which services you want to participate in or which sort of uses within the broader category that service is engaged in. But I recognize that that opens the field up even wider for what we should discuss. And I do think it would be helpful to, drive the discussion much more narrowly about particular pieces to make progress.
Right.
I'll just cover the quick points. I definitely agree about the survey. I mean, I think that's the purpose of having this open forum is for people to come in and represent their perspectives, and hopefully they show up. I don't know if there's a good way or an intelligent way for this group to kind of go out and figure out what other people want. I think there are lots of places to find that as well, other than a survey, because they do tend to talk a lot about what they want and put them in their terms of use sometimes. But I think that the proposal as it relates to what we've been talking about in the context of search and AI use is helpful and headed in the right direction. So in my mind, I kind of see it as a supplement to the document that we've been working on, or at least, that's maybe the sort of potential path of least resistance. I wouldn't kind of see this as an either or. So I think it's a good place to start mining for some definitions and issues. I am a bit sort of like still stuck in my head as well about the focus on display. I think that it is one of the most obvious places to look in terms of what you would want to express a preference about, but it is a very specific prism of search, even if it can apply in other contexts. I'm hearing some folks struggling, and I am struggling too, with like thinking about all the different scenarios where there could be a use that is important and valuable and hits on an interest that I just don't have in my head right now, because from a publisher perspective, we do tend to look at these things through a search lens, but that's just one of those things. I'm thinking about the creation of a RAG index, for example, even if the content itself is not reproduced or displayed in a way that relates to the preference. Is that included as well? And it also leads me down a path which we haven't really talked a lot about, but maybe is something just to also consider we can open up an issue on, is the principle about combining preferences or in any way making preferences dependent on each other. that in order to allow the free and effective expression of a preference, that there shouldn't be any kind of dependency that's created, that you can only express a preference relating to one of the categories if you also allow another. So I think that maybe is a bit. Yeah, I just think it's something to think about when we're kind of getting to that granular level of having to go through the steps of what you want to have displayed and not displayed. That sometimes there can be some dependencies that could come into play, and I think we want to make sure that each category is independently exercisable.
We've locked the queue. We're just going to wrap this up, try and get a sense of the group, take a break, and then we'll get to more of the discussion of hierarchical and top level after the break, I think. Paul, go ahead. I think if you got that in somewhere. Wait, here comes one.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to where we got the first discussion about search from, and I don't. Somebody here referenced that, or I think it was you who said like it was seen as a necessary carve out from a too broad top level category.
From the training category.
But let me disagree. My point is, at least in some of the discussions we had prior to this forum existing. The question was that, which were based on where the top level category was seen as to be the EU's definition of text and data mining. There was a lot of differences of opinion if text and data mining as defined by the EU included current 3 years ago search practices or not. And I think if you read the thing, you probably would come to the conclusion that some of the things that people were doing 3 years ago to enable search systems might be impossible. Since we have moved away from linking the top level category, if we still have it, let's assume we still have it, from the definition that is like linking it, making it one-on-one with the definition or as close as possible to the definition in the EU, we might just exclude search, like the retrieval, like however you define that, difficult, from the top level category, right? Like make an explicit carve out in the top level category, which would mean the carve out sort of like cascades down to all of the other categories. So that would remove this thing if and the purpose of this carve out was to remove the uncertainty around if I say no to this, do I accidentally say no to appearing in search results? It's obvious that there's still some, that a lot of search involves AI. The question is if this difference between training users or pre-training, post-training provides some meaningful protection here. Like if you opt out from the training things, I think you could make an argument that it is not a necessary condition for something to be found to be also included in the training data of all the systems powering that search. Because otherwise, sort of like search engines would be pretty useless because they could only find things which they have been trained on. So I think there is some protection against like stuff getting removed from search. I see you worrying. So in the fact that you're explicitly focusing, having this distinction between training and post-training. So, but I think that the more like maybe that muddies it. Like I think the more important proposal is to say like if we have the carve out at the top level category, that might sort of like prevent, at least address the problem of uncertainty in a more meaningful way than us getting a category exactly right somewhere at a lower level.
So Felix, with your apologies, just pause for just a second, because that's a great launching place for where we want to try and make a decision here, which is, in one possible future, we could restate that carve out to be more embedded, like you're saying, Paul, either in the top level or in whatever we do define, whatever that formulation is, that's a separable decision, but it's not a separate term effectively anymore. The other direction we could go is what we're hearing is a certain amount of interest across the room in getting much more fine-grained about search control as a particular use. And whether that's specific to AI or not is, well, that's an interesting discussion to have. And so maybe Felix, you can say what your piece, and then maybe we can do a poll to try and figure out if there's a strong sense of where we want to go with that.
Yeah, this was more a reaction to the question, what is display based? So I just want to check my own understanding. So my understanding was you have an AI system, and if that AI system is generating an output, and that output is then passed on to the end user, that is display. Is that correct? So for the example that was used, I think about building an index, I guess you could include it in the index, but the moment you end up sharing the part of the index in response to a user query, then I guess it would be display. So it just happens at a later point. So basically, yes, you can look at a piece of content for analysis, for example, analysis for the purpose of deciding whether this is something that should show up in search results at all as a link. But the moment you want to use it as part of a generative AI output that you then pass on to the end user, for example, an AI summary, if it says no display text, then you would not be able to do that. At least that's how I understand what display means. And I see Krishna nodding.
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like people have a few more comments. Let's reopen the queue briefly, and then let's do a poll, and then maybe go break after that. So folks will limit their comments to what we're talking about right now. That would be helpful. Let's unlock the queue. Anyone? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, this is sort of in direct response to Felix, really, that I think, so look, I'm thinking about sort of agentic type use cases where the output of an AI model may then be passed on to further AI models where these may be run by different organizations. So I think relying on display as in it's actually rendered to a human may not be quite what we're looking for. It's like the output being passed on to some consumer, which may be human, but it may also be at some other sort of automated system that consumes the output. So I think we want a definition that caters for both of those circumstances, I think.
If I can ask a follow-up question to that, is there a human at the end of the agentic chain? So would it be helpful if the signal is passed on?
Potentially, I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
Okay. Bradley.
Just to add a little bit of context about my RAG index point. So the reason why it's on my mind is that obviously not all deployers or creators of services based on AI models are going to be able to create their own indexes. And so wholesaling RAG indexes for the purposes of providing grounded search results is, in the marketplace. And so, the fact that they're one step removed from actually enabling the display means that they would be able to create a RAG index that they could wholesale to third parties and say to them, by the way, there are preferences attached to what's in here, but they would still be creating a product based on the grounded content being collected.
Erin?
Yeah, so we've been having a little bit of follow-up chat on the search category in the chat. And I made the point that, having a category like that does lessen the burden on website operators to know and declare every crawler in the category, which particularly makes it helpful for like lesser well-known search engines who wouldn't have their user agent known and declared. But that line drawing is the problem. And the existing search use category attempts to draw a line between traditional search, which is, title, link, snippet, and the more contemporary generative summary AI inflected kind of search. And I feel like that distinction draws a really artificial line that is going to reify today's product design and not allow for flexibility in future product designs. Whereas something like Krishna's exact text preference is a bit more, I would say, like binary and easier to follow in a way that allows for other kind of flexible developments in future.
Go. Kevin. So I had this thought when Brad was talking just a second ago, but I think it lines up with what Aaron was saying too. What do we think about a solution that looks like the adopted draft, but instead of search or something else on the inference side, we use something like what Krishna has proposed?
Which categories? All of them, or just?
The sort of more classically display-oriented ones, I mean.
So what categories would you be retaining?
Sorry, I use the mic.
What categories would you be retaining in that case? In the other?
And I'm spitballing here. So training and generative training from the adopted draft. And then from Krishna's proposal, not the generative AI training labeling there, but the things that are about the presentation of sorry, apparently I'm more jet lagged than I remembered.
It's a bad spot. It's a bad part of that mood now.
This is
This is in California.
Does that make any sort of sense?
So it would be the categories that are in Krishna's draft plus AI training.
And Gen AI training.
Yeah, because Gen AI training. Is that right?
So you're also arguing against the top level category.
Right. But I think we're doing what Felix is thinking about, is kind of ranking all of the decisions we have to make, which, Eric.
Oh, I thought also was ahead of me. Yeah, I mean, I think, I do think these are difficult decisions. I think, honestly, I think we're still in it. What do people call it? The storming phase. I think we're going to have to like kind of bounce around for a little while before we make any plausible decisions. I certainly want to hear more about some of the ideas people are. I think some brainstorming here is required, trying to like I look at both of these and I feel like they're not quite adequate. And so, like, I think some work is sort of required here, obviously. To the extent which is helpful, I did cook up like my list of like things you might want to be able to say without any attempt to turn that into a grammar. I like that in the chat if you want to look at it. I think this is useful not to discuss particularly if it's an intuition pump. Like if you look at this and you're like, I want to be able to say these things, ask yourself if the approach you favor or their favor will allow you to say those things. And if you think you don't, if you can't say those things, then ask yourself if you want to say them.
We're going to cut the queue again because we do need to get a break soon. But can you send that link to the list as well?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Oh, that's fine.
Just send a text to us.
Yeah, I'll send the text. Yeah.
Sounds good. I was waiting for people. Yeah, thanks.
Just, I guess, voicing something I put in the chat. I think it's not enough to like try to address some fraction of the problem and then declare that we're sort of putting a Band-Aid in that makes sure that there's no collateral damage by virtue of not having addressed the rest of the problem, like that doesn't really seem like a reasonable outcome for an IETF working group. And that's a little bit what I feel like some people are suggesting, that like we can just like stick with the original concept of what we had here and just, you know, make sure that we're not accidentally giving publishers a sort of Faustian bargain. So I think it makes a lot more sense to me to actually try to address the problems that people are bringing to the working group, and they are in scope to do that. I liked that people started thinking about how these drafts work together. They had in my mind that was always what I was thinking. I guess it was more implicit for other people, but it does seem like there is genuine value in continuing to discuss these more granular preferences, and also I would not like rush us along to say like we have to come to consensus on something. There's a bunch of people who want to like do a deep dive on these individual preferences that Krishna suggested in his draft, and I think that's a good idea to do.
Sorry about that. We muted the room for a listen, forgot to unmute. Sorry about that. So we're just having a discussion with Krishna about the intent of his draft, which was whether it was to be a standalone proposal or something that's a collection of ideas. And I think really it's both in some ways, depending on how discussion goes. So, Caleb.
I was just going back to if, as you take a look through Ecker's excellent initial list of what preferences people might want to suggest, and taking into account Bradley's idea that, you know, these categories should be independent of one another, and they shouldn't, you know, opting out of one thing shouldn't overly affect your opt-in or opt-out status of another. Those are thought of another way. They're product design questions, and so we should be mindful that proliferating may seem like a good idea to proliferate choices and categories, but first of all, if a category is inseparable from other types of use, it will result in more opt-out than is necessary. And second, overly granular preferences going forward will shape product design. So it's not merely a question of reflecting what exists today, but a question of how do we balance the impact on the ability to deliver products in the future. So that may be one reason for taking another look.
Okay. So before we go to break, we just wanted to do a pair of polls just to get a sense of where the group is at and see if we can move forward with discussion. Obviously, there's a lot more to be discussed in this area. I think, as Alyssa said, we're really just starting some of this. But just getting a sense and hopefully confirming what seems to be emerging. I'm going to ask two questions. And they're both assertions of preference. First is we should limit search to being a carve-out to assure that preferences do not affect it. So this kind of very limited approach that we've talked about in the past. And the second question is we should define more fine-grained search and other controls. So it's this conservative, just make it a carve-out approach. Do you prefer that? If so, vote yes. Or this more expansive, let's go fine-grained, as a little discussion we've had in the last hour or two has been. Should we take that approach? Make sense? Alyssa?
Sorry, are we get a yes, no on each of these?
A yes on each one, yes. That's what the instructor gives us.
Okay.
thought you could do, you're gonna be big.
Does a yes on the first one imply this particular search use definition? Or possible?
It's a general approach. Don't get too hung up on the exact what it is. So let's see, full tool. It just gives you yes, no, and don't know, basically.
This tool is so bad.
Okay, here's the first one.
At least we have spent a huge amount of time trying to figure out what other option.
So this is the conservative or
just let us put strings in.
Status quo in the draft. Search is just a carve out to make sure that people don't shoot themselves in the foot if they try and turn AI off, basically. No.
No, I just can't answer it.
Yeah, fair.
Doesn't it depend on whether or not we take Krishna's approach versus we stick with the original? Is that
Well, that question isn't on the table yet.
Right.
No, it's just, how do you conceptualize, what do you think we should go with the search discussion? Is it just what we've talked about before, or we've seen a lot of interest in making it more granular? So trying to separate that out from the specifics, because if you start talking about Krishna's draft, there's a lot of discussion around display-based and stuff and so on, and I don't want to distract with that. So right now we're leaning towards no. And again, this is just gathering information. This isn't making a decision.
This is also not exclusive. So
No, it's not.
You can have both.
Sure, you could say I've got either way. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to close this one in just a moment. So 11 yes, 16 no, and 8 no opinion. And the second one. Here we go. We should define fine-grained search and other controls. Another reason there, so that's not potentially just search.
Can you just explain the question?
No. It's what it is. It's what it is. You gotta like to interpret it in your head.
Let's preference. You have to interpret
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got 16 yes, 4 no, and 8 Martins.
Well, you're not going to explain the question.
I'm not in the opinion category. I'm in the this is a bad question category.
So the question is trying.
That's not the thing.
Yeah, but talk to those teams. The question is trying to say, we've had this discussion now of, Krishna's proposal is one instance of a more granular approach to doing this.
But it doesn't have to be only search, right?
Well, and that's why it says and other. But search is the instance that's in front of us right now of interesting things to talk.
Maybe not. I don't know.
If I got 3 things, it's a 12.
So if it's about Krishna's proposal, then
Krishna's proposal is many things.
yeah, exactly. So I wish we had gone. Okay, so
Well,
okay.
we all wish many things.
So yes, so but I really like Ecker's work on a lot of things, but the document, like the fine-grained document that we're coming up with, it looks too granular for me. So
Okay, so you're probably not for this one.
if this question is about like the discussion that we had about
It's a way to shape the way we use our time. So should we continue discussing these more fine-grained controls? Not any particular proposal yet, but
I certainly wasn't suggesting that anyone would adopt the crap back witness document. That's intended to ask the question.
Thank you.
The question is
Great
intended to ask is, if you think your thing can't express any of these things, and you think they're important to express, we got a problem, right? That's all I'm trying to say. If you think we should express
But
them.
then another question that we should ask is, are there alternatives to the protocol that you can use? Are there
Absolutely.
alternatives that are more
Yep.
suitable?
Yep.
So, okay, sorry, I answered.
all right. So I'm going to close the poll. So it seems like there's an appetite. Oh, one more person just as I close the poll. It seems like there's an appetite to pursue this fine grained discussion a bit more. Yes, Ken.
Do we think that's in opposition to the folks who this morning thought we should just have a simple no training thing and move on?
That's a great question. I think maybe, but what you're seeing there is some level of acceptance that we can't just do that. Let's take a break. It's 12:47, so let's come back at 3:15, and we're scheduled to go to 4:30. So 3:15 local time, please be ready to come back.
There you guys are. We were getting worried about you.
Were you imagining some sort of crawl breaking out in the hallway?
Yes, actually, given that everything going on over there.
Maybe a pub crawl break.
Yeah.
No, that was when we were in London. That would have been more appropriate.
That could be more productive. Okay, folks, let's get started again. Come back in the room, please. We have most people, but not quite all.
Rough consensus parking.
Oh, you're in the toilet, you're in the rock. Yes.
That's what I suspected.
They were taking some hugs right now. You missed it.
That's how this works. Okay. So before the break, we were kind of concentrating on this.
Concentrate?
Sorry.
Concentrate? Kind of
concentrate on this.
Kind of does a lot of work there.
Discussion of search and display based and purpose and use and that general area. And it sounds like there is an amount of appetite to pursue those concepts in some form. And so I think what we might do is encourage folks to think and talk more about that. Krishna, it sounds like you might want to develop your ideas more. I encourage you to think about, to the degree that's possible, segmenting them into areas of, where there, of course, there are overlaps and connections, but if you can minimize those connections to the degree possible and componentize it, that would really help, I think, the decision-making process. Because if we have to consider the whole ball of wax at one time, it becomes more difficult. And other folks, if they have proposals that they think that can gain consensus, and that's, I think, the most important thing here is making a proposal that makes you happy, but doesn't satisfy other people's needs is not really helping. It's trying to find those proposals that can get to that middle ground. Please write those down, emails, internet drafts, whatever is appropriate, and we'll see if we can take those forward. We don't necessarily need to capture these issues. I think we have a lot of this captured in the issues list. It's more getting the crisp proposals for how to think about how to move forward. What we might do for the rest of the day then, because we've got about an hour and 10 minutes, is go to the other part of Krishna's proposal, which is removing that top level category. So, Krishna, do you want to maybe introduce your thinking there and give some context? Let's unlock the key for folks.
So in the draft that exists right now, the TDM category we felt was overly broad. And this was one of the reasons why we developed the proposal that we did to address some of the breadth and the coverage of the TDM. So I think there was a question that was asked as part of the submission process. I think Martin asked if we wanted to remove the category, and I said, yes, we do. The way it's written right now, TDM pretty much blocks every potential processing of any of the documents. So the issue that we raised was it should be removed as a top level category. I mean, here people say that, well, what if we change the definitions? I've heard some of these concepts being discussed, but in our mind, that category is not really needed. That's the issue we presented. Leave it up and see what people say.
Okay, so Mark.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a good point to sort of come back to the question of the preferences. And I had a couple of conversations with folks during the break now, and I think there's a lack of clarity about, and I think this framing as this is overly broad is a very interesting statement to examine a little more closely, because we're talking about preferences. Preferences could be extraordinarily broad and potentially not lead to the sorts of problems that some people have identified. I think The concern that is rightly raised in this context is not that something is broad or too narrow or what have you, because it is just as big as it is. People are expressing preferences at some level. We could have a category which is any use, and that would not be overly broad if we think about it in the context of preferences necessarily, because we are relying on this being just a preference that someone's expressing that can be then ignored or abided by according to whatever context you have available to you, which is probably going to be more precise context than the person who is expressing that preference. Maybe you're developing a public safety application that's going to completely ignore any preferences that people have. So I think it's probably more interesting to talk about unintended consequences out of something like this than whether something is too broad or not. And I think it was Echo who expressed this concern, where someone might express a preference about X and be surprised to find that that covers some potential use in the future that they hadn't anticipated. So some potential application that someone saw that preference, decided to abide by that preference, and that outcome would be surprising to someone as a result. And I do agree that that is a potential outcome that may happen in this TDM category. Because what happens is there's going to be some classes of use that people will look at that and say, this is clearly cause for me to ignore preferences expressed about this particular class of use, whether that be for accessibility, for research, for translations, for public safety, for doing scam and fraud management, or whatever. But the question is whether there's anything that falls under one of these categories of use that ends up being in that sort of ambiguous zone, where it's maybe not something we've anticipated in our considerations here. It's a new application that we haven't thought about, and some future product manager looks at in this case, the top level TDM category and says, no, I'm going to respect that preference for this particular application because someone's expressed that preference, and the person expressing that preference did not intend for that to happen. They did not intend for their content or what have you to be passed through, and that I think is the grey zone that exists. Not is it too broad or what have you. It's the question of unintended consequences. Does that make sense?
So I think, that's your perspective, but I feel like the breadth of the category itself renders it to a tremendous amount of misinterpretation and unintended harms. Notwithstanding another section that we have that says, oh, these kinds of categories are exempt from that, but that doesn't cover all the applications. So it opens up a lot of ambiguity. And then in order to solve it, we have to resort to other subcategories that we will have to address in order to fix the Uber category that is either wrongly labeled or framed or defined.
Edgar. So, Martin, I certainly agree with you that that people should express the things they want to express, and if they want to express something very broad, then they should be able to express that, and that unintended consequences is like the main consideration asked about this. With respect to this particular one, however, I think, as I sort of said in a previous email, I don't understand how it's different from just saying no in robots. And so I think.
Oh, that's got an easy answer.
Okay, can you explain to me?
Yeah. We're trying to get some mics. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
That bit of Krishna.
No, I think because, yeah. So this question has come up a number of times, and I think it comes down to this question of the distinction between acquisition and use. So if you put a disallow rule in robots text that says you can't have this content, in some ways that's analogous to not allowing someone to fetch the content in the first place and just returning a 404 or what have you in response to the HTTP request. That's it's a matter of degree. But saying crawl is not here is like a very absolute thing. But with a preference, there are cases where you might have you might expect people to have reasons that override your preferences, and so the anti-scam fraud thing, the translation thing, there are a bunch of cases that people have raised as being reasons that override any preferences that someone might express.
So let me see if I can echo back what I think you just said.
Right.
Which is that the difference is not the scope is different, but that for some reason you think this is a more advisory message than the robust message. Okay, I think I have to go read 9390 again to see if I agree with that. But I think thank you. Now I understand what your point is because I think the scope was co-extensive.
Right.
Mark.
Hi everyone. I know this is a lot. I actually wanted to ask, I think, a question sort of related to that, and if this is something I just don't have context for, coming in a little bit new, I apologize. But how does the possibility of people not consuming or not honoring or respecting preferences, how does that play into the work we're doing as we're thinking about designing the preferences and the vocabulary and what they correspond with? Is the fact that a preference can be ignored sufficient to avoid issues where sort of a strict application of the preferences is going to be a problem or uncomfortable in some ways, or lead to what we might consider technically or socially suboptimal outcomes? Or is that a consideration, but still something we need to try to solve in the way we are drafting the standard in the first place? I honestly, just as someone new to IETF, I'm not entirely sure how we conceptualize this.
Editors, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I mean, the current document has this section 3.2 in it, which has been highly controversial.
Yes.
Don't mind for it. I typically understate these things all the time. I think that's a fair understatement of the situation. The whole point of that is to essentially establish what I was talking about just now, which is that there is an expectation that circumstances known to the person consuming the content will provide them with context that the person expressing the preference doesn't have, such that they might be able to conclude that their interest in using that particular content in a particular way overrides those preferences. And I think probably the most important one that continues to come back over and over again is if you're taking the content and feeding it into the training of the model that's going to be used by a great many people, then maybe some people would say yes or no to that particular one. But if it's something that's connected to the immediate use of an individual human, then maybe that overrides the preferences in that particular circumstance. Maybe that human has directed you specifically to that content and said, please summarize this content for me. Now, in that situation, there might be a preference that's attached to that says TDM no or AI use no or whatever it is that's associated with that. But that's just going to be blown straight through by the system that recognizes that the interest of the person asking for that particular action overrides any preferences that have been expressed by some web server somewhere.
So I guess I understand in that specific example why it would make sense to override or ignore the preference in that case. I think my question is just more broadly, like, sort of what, as someone who talks, I think, to sort of other folks who are consumers and sometimes are not confident about overriding, or they, you know, just like I think some users of these preferences, they may not understand exactly when it is like permissible or okay to override them. I think the question is just like, as designers and as drafters of a standard, like what role does the possibility of ignoring preferences play in sort of the broader architectural decisions we're making? Rather, like, yes, there are going to be, I think we can all think of situations here in this room where individually it would make sense to override the preference. I guess the question is just what role does that possibility play in the design process, is what I was trying to get at. But thank you.
I think it fundamentally shaped the design process in the fact that we're actually talking about preferences. Like that is, I think, the most important thing. These are preferences. They are, it's stated at multiple parts also in the introduction that sort of like the legal validity, a number of the reasons to ignore or not, like are really dependent on context. Therefore, we have early in the process, this working group was originally called AI control, and the move away from control to preferences is exactly the design consideration to address what you're saying.
Thank you.
Marius.
Actually, on the similar side, I think most users do more care about that their content is not used in a certain use cases, rather that they want to make sure that their content is used in a certain use case that they would support. So I don't think that the problem necessarily is this unintended consequences in the sense that I'm overly broad and I'm not allowing my data to be used in a certain use case. From a user's point of view, I don't think they care too much about. I mean, like they might care, but I don't think that's kind of what they want to address. That they have a certain way to say my data is excluded. I think that's what users want. On the content user side, you can migrate this problem of unintended consequences by just ignoring it, right? You just like use it. There is, of course, a risk if there's a lot of restrictions that maybe our services that people decide to not use it and the services get worse or the internet get more closed or whatever. But you can migrate this unintended consequences by making a decision to ignore the preferences. So I don't think unintended consequences are really the big problem. The problem is if too many people choose to ignore the preferences because they think they have a good use case, the preferences become useless. Because at that point, the user doesn't know anymore if it reaches its goal or not. So if you are super broad and you have all these exclusive cases, then it's not useful anymore.
Right. And that gets back when we had the way back in the workshop, we talked about enforcement and how the trust problem was kind of one of the core issues here. Aaron.
I got it. I got it. I need the exercise.
Yeah, I think the idea that preferences aren't totally absolute can be useful when there is some edge case that was unanticipated or some flexibility around the margins. But if there are broad use cases that are kind of well defined and fairly well understood in advance, it's sort of nonsensical to scope them into the permission or the preference and then say, oh, but you can ignore this. It should just be defined out. And I say that in part because there will be outside forces compelling compliance with some of these preferences in some circumstances. And there will be voluntary over compliance in others, right? Like, there's a right of quotation that says no copyright owner can stop you from repeating short extracts of their work. And yet most, I would say, online players voluntarily honor a no snippet request. And so understanding that the enforcement here is not going to perfectly match up with the preference definition, I think we still need to give a preference definition that creates clarity and reduces ambiguity, for exactly the reason of, the preference won't work if everybody expects it to be ignored. And if nobody knows exactly what they are supposed to be honoring, then there's no way to really honor it in practice.
Can I just, I fully understand your point, and I think in general, it's a very valid point. The problem is, it's really hard to address. Give you one example, right? Like in the no training preference, or any of the preferences, if you were a U-based academic researcher or sort of researcher in a cultural heritage organization, you have the positive right to do all of these things. But that is a well-known sort of thing where we would think Article 3 should apply, but we cannot put this into the scope of the preference itself because it is a sort of limited to a fairly small part of the world. So design, like the problem is that lots of the underlying legal territorial complexities that we deal with, other copyright exceptions similar, right, are really hard to meaningfully encode in the preferences themselves. Did you want to respond to that?
Actually, yeah. I think that that is a helpful, motivating example, but it, to me, that points to we should not be attempting to match the legal contours or encode legal rights in these preferences. But, you know, we've talked about things like, you know, user requested fetches being outside of this scope, and that's a broad category that isn't a legal defined one, isn't limited to a particular part of the world. And there seems to be pretty broad consensus that it should be outside the scope, right? So I think we do need to get more precise about where we're going to eliminate ambiguity.
I also want to say that we need to do both, right? Where we can, like the example you gave, I think is a really good example where it's sort of like, I think, a consensual thing, which is not necessarily nothing on the law, but in some cases we also may not be able. So that means even if we added that to the scope of the preferences and not in 3.2 where we have it right now, we still would need 3.2 for other edge cases. So where we can be more precise, where we can map these things to this, and I think I made on mailing this suggestion exactly to that part for the user rights in when the substitution category was proposed. We should absolutely do that, but we will not be able to do that in all cases.
Or
Yeah, I mean, I sort of like the message of, you know, we keep saying that these are just preferences. And we state in the document that this isn't a legal thing, it's explaining preferences. The issue is, once this is created, I think it very quickly turns into, this is a requirement, this is a legal requirement, somebody has stated it, you're required to follow it. Especially if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions. Right? Like, I can't read a couple of the newspapers in the county I live, because if I try and go to it from the EU, it says, there's this whole GDPR thing that's too hard for us to figure out what it means. And so, like, we're just not going to show you the content. Or the standard problem of, like, all the cookie things you have to click through. Right? I think we end up in this, people ending up over-interpreting what the regulations have, or just it's so hard to figure out which ones apply. Just being like, I'm going to ignore some set of user preferences, works for a few weeks, and then it ends up in regulation.
I think Warren, your point is right, but I think, like Paul was saying, right, it's not up to us to enforce it. These things live in a like regulatory and legal regime that would like say like what you can safely ignore and what you cannot, right? Like so, yeah. For like I think people brought up the ADA, right? And like you know, if you have some kind of transformation that changes like audio to video or like audio to text or text to audio or whatever, right? Like I think that would be allowed no matter what you say. But I think us being not limited to a specific regulatory regime means that we can only show them as preferences, right? And then somebody could make law that would say, hey, this is like something you should follow, right? I think that's at least like how we envisioned it, right? Like when we start out, but maybe there is some stuff missing because like there is certainly like a mapping of this to a legal thing, which we are not qualified to do.
Sure.
Right?
But the message has been, we don't need to worry about this turning into regulation because we said there's a preference or something. And I think that that's a false thing. I think we are creating a set of tools that while we might think of them as preferences, are very going to quickly turn into indifferent regimes.
Right. So, and I think this gets back to the discussion we had before the break. Between Ecker and Martin, where it's one thing to say we need to be careful to make sure that the preferences we allow people to allow them to express themselves accurately, and to reduce misinterpretation where possible, although some amount of slop is always going to happen. But it's quite another thing to just appeal to the effects of, oh, well, these preferences can be expressed and this might happen out in the world. And it's like, well, yes, but people expressed their preferences and they were accurate. And that's a different thing.
I also, honestly, I mean, that is a sort of hypothetical, right? Like that's will happen, and there's many other hypotheticals, and then we don't define anything, and people make even more stupid rules, right? Like I think I would see this as, apologies to the regulators who might be listening. I see this as an effort of this group bringing together people who think like, we as a group have a higher chance of coming to a result that minimizes the amount of damage that can arise um, from legislative intervention in this space.
Problem is people have different interpretations of damage.
Which is why there's more than one in this group.
Yeah.
So I haven't, I never liked the TDM framework, and I can't. Is this working?
Is it on? Is it green or red? The light?
It's now green and red at the same time.
At the same time?
Like Christmas trees. Okay.
Is that one working?
Yes. So I've been making this, and I like Krishna's draft because I think that it addresses the concern that some of us have been raising since the beginning with the text and data mining category, which was changed to automated processing. But I think that even made the matter a little bit worse because automated processing is not as well established. The definition is not as well established as the TDM. So I just wanted to put it on the record that also when we keep talking about like, okay, what will happen to the user, but also what will happen to the, but when we have such broad categories, we should also think about not-for-profit and research organizations and archives that will be like kind of getting these signals might interpret it widely and they think that they cannot do the job that they are doing. And these are the issues that have been raising over time. And this is why I like Krishna's solution to this.
So just to be clear there, you said you had the pushback against you, and that was the explanation was what you just said, that the impact on
yes.
these uses. Okay. And we've heard from other folks that, the answer to that is that, these are just preferences and that we have 3.2 or things like that. And you're saying that's not adequate, basically.
No, that is not adequate because like we have standard, like if there was there was no incentive to follow standards, we wouldn't have come up with them in the first place. Sorry, this is a very simple thing that I'm saying, but I think that there are especially market incentives out there that make following standards for those who follow it better off than not following it. So these are not just signaling preferences. And I think that there is a paragraph in our internet draft, in the Keller and Thompson internet draft that we've been working on, that mentions that, I don't want to misframe it, but it mentions that under what circumstances you don't have to follow the preferences, if I'm right. It has some kind of language there. And I think that we should keep that language if we keep TDM or automated processing. But that language is an example of in how many cases we have to signal to people that, hey, it's okay not to follow these preferences. That wasn't very clear, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
I'll just step in for a second
Sure.
to respond to Fars. So Fars, imagine if we don't have the TDM, right? The problem still exists that people can express a preference and so we cannot take that text away because it's still a preference. So I'm trying hard to understand why you think that thing is related to TDM being present.
Because it's very broad, and actually TDM is better than automated processing that we have at the moment. But I believe that TDM is broad and it can include many functions.
No, but let's say TDM goes away. Imagine we take away TDM and the automated use, like processing, and we take all of that away, right? Like there is still potentially a need for somebody to override this thing. So that thing was added, right? Like because like somebody Leela like wrote something which says like, hey, like there's all these reasons that like let's say internet archive. It's like, hey, I want to be able to do this archiving thing, and I have this like cultural heritage reason to do it, right? So that like so they wanted that exemplar to say that preferences can be overridden for some other reason. So like that text is kind of not there because of the overly broad category, but that even the more specific thing that Erin was talking about, you might have a reason to override it. And I think that's what we start off with, like however specific, like we have it, the preference could be overridden for some other reason that's not within our control, was at least the high level thinking on it, right? And so I think Ecker's point, which I totally agree with, is like if you want to express some preference, you should be able to clearly express it without like any overshoot or like being too specific. As long as you're expressing it, whether or not it's followed is not something we can enforce. I think that's kind of why the text got in there, not because it's too broad. So I understand your concern about it being too broad, but those are two separate things. Because like I really don't think we have the authority to, like, I think Warren has this badge saying, the Internet Police badge, and he probably still has to carry it. Yeah, but I think that's the issue. We don't have the enforcement authority for this. So,
Ecker.
Here.
Oh, great, thanks. Awesome. So, I do want to actually maybe switch gears a tiny bit to ask, is this in fact saying the thing we think it's supposed to say? This is, I think a point that Greg Linnell made on the list is that if read literally, I think this basically, this is like a preference that says don't crawl, right? Because you hit the first page and then you say, we can't even process it for links. And so, like, I'm not saying people shouldn't be allowed to say that, but I'm saying, is that in fact what people want to say here? And I strongly suspect that it is not. And I wonder if we need to narrow it and somehow, like, I don't know how, but like, I strongly suspect people actually want to say something somewhat narrower.
Yeah. So brief interjection on that point. I think it was never the intent to say that if you said TDM no, you weren't able to crawl the sites. I think that's just a mistake on our part. And now the question then becomes whether we make that part of the definition or talk about, that's just an oversight on our part, never intentional.
That's what I assumed as well. I think I don't know quite what the I don't know quite what the language has to be here, but like obviously I can compress it and I can like count the words and like all kinds of ridiculous like global processing stuff I should be able to do, right? So we have to figure out how to cabin that off. I guess I'm like I think I'm also just want to reiterate like I think some of the point I heard Aaron making, which is like these are not going to be optional in some cases, and so it is like incumbent on us to get them right, and not just be like the escape hatches. Oh, we were just kidding because it was like we said you got the fall at 3.2, both because it is going to be the case that they won't be optional legally in some cases, and also the case that people will not, that asking people to make individualized judgments about whether their needs override the preferences of the site is already like a burden on them. And so like it is a bug if we if we force sites to say things that are stupid and then people have to say, well, actually I'm going to ignore that. That is a bug, and we make sure the sites actually say things that are smart. But again, not stopping them from saying things that are stupid if they want to.
We've got Elliot.
Well, greetings from 20 kilometers away, and I hope you guys are having a great meeting. I've been enjoying just listening to this discussion, and it occurred to me that we're an optimistic lot, thinking that people are going to latch on to whatever it is we publish very quickly. What I was also pondering is if we're really worried about this topic of regulators jumping on the boat a little too quickly, there are avenues that we have to essentially crawl, walk, run, and one of which is you back off the notion of coming out with a standard day one, but instead maybe consider coming out with experimental drafts, either in draft form, or as experimental RFCs, and actually trying something, getting a little bit more running code so we understand where things really are pitfalls a little bit more versus, trying to imagine every dark corner that might exist with the work that you're putting out. And I think this is really important work, but I think if I read the minutes correctly from this morning, which I couldn't attend, you guys said you didn't have to get this done out immediately. So maybe an alternative to that is get something out, try it a little bit more, and then revise. And when you feel comfortable, maybe you'll feel less the need to have that section 3.2. Thanks for your comments. And by the way, it's available for dinner if you guys have the ability to include one.
That advertisement.
Isn't that at Elliot's house?
Yeah, just wanted to sort of jump on some of the conversation that's been going on from the chat, which I think is also relevant, which is that, one of the things that we've done, and maybe, and I think it's probably worth, undoing, is that in the vocabulary document, we've gone beyond just stating, here are what these things are that you can state. But, as we've been talking about, we put in things like 3.2 and related. How does this relate to enforcement? How do, when is this respected? That sort of thing. And maybe one of the things we ought to consider, again, because of the need for the vocabulary document as a much more flexible, statement of vocabulary, more so than statement of implementation, is to take all of that sort of material out, move it to the attachment documents, and let that be handled as it's related to specific attachments, such as, robots or C2PA or IPTC or whatever it might be. And that at least might give us a way to move vocabulary forward, which we have to do before we can get to the other ones anyway. Thanks.
Thanks, Leonard. Paul.
We're not hearing Paul if he's talking.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Leonard.
It's not completely dead. Sorry, no. So there's a purpose why we have this top level category, which is we need to relate, like we know that we or anyone parsing instructions about AI will run into expressions of machine readable opt-outs against TDM from the EU. And the main purpose of having this top level category, and why I, as far as probably think that it is good to have it closely aligned to that thing, is that we need to be able to treat that as that signal needs to become an operational signal in the vocabulary. Otherwise, you will need to sort of each and every other attachment mechanism which deals with this question will also need to have some kind of proprietary, private, specific sort of interface with how do you factor in TDM opt-outs under the US.
But that's already the case now, and it has nothing to do with AI.
Why is it it has TDM as a category also covers many forms of at least AI training.
Right now, yes.
Yeah, right now. If you run into that signal, my point is that you need to define okay, what does that signal mean for if I'm interested to understand if I can train a model, yes or no. So the fact that there's an overarching hierarchical category is, and we're mapping this saying that this is bigger, this contains the underlying training and the underlying generative AI training category. The point of this is I can interpret that thing based on the rules specified in the vocabulary. If not, I need to interpret that information based on some other rules that we don't have specified. So we know this interpretation problem will arise if somebody goes sort of on a relatively wide content acquisition spree.
I don't understand this argument. Can you rephrase it?
Yeah, I don't understand it either because TDM exists for a while, right? So this problem already exists. It's completely independent if you train.
No, vocabulary doesn't exist. The point is why does
But why do we need to address that part of a problem that already exists while we are chartered to base your
I'm
argument?
not saying a problem exists. I'm saying TDM opt-outs exist. And we're trying to make a wide multitude of different signals that are currently not standardized, legible, also in relationship to each other. If we remove this top level category, which was modeled to represent that particular sort of expression of or a reservation of a right, then the vocabulary itself does not allow us to relate that signal to other signals that we have defined in the vocabulary. So removing it means like we're basically doing this sort of mapping exercise. We're saying like, not our problem, solve that yourself. And the question is that a useful approach or is it not? Does that make the vocabulary more useful or does it not? And I think by including the top level category, we're actually making the vocabulary in the end more useful.
Sonia, you need a microphone, don't you? Let's fix that. Here. Oh, never mind. Paul's got it. Okay.
Thank you.
I think the fourth mic is getting charged.
Want to agree with the concerns that I've heard on TDM as a category. I think actually, as everyone agrees, the categories need to be clear and they need to be actionable. TDM is certainly not that. Aside from the use cases that might be seen as permissible, even when a TDM category is expressed, people will have very different interpretations of what TDM actually means. And why do we actually need such a broad category? The EU directive has been mentioned, but even the EU TDM exception doesn't function as any type of control or preference. We need to understand that it's an exception that was intended to make it clear that you could perform text and data mining among other exceptions that also exist in relation to text and data mining. And when someone expresses a reservation of rights, it reserves that specific exception, but it doesn't reserve the other exceptions that also apply to text and data mining. So there is this lack of clarity about what we mean by a TDM exception. And also, I think, as was just mentioned, it's not specifically an AI preference. It includes AI, but it's much broader. It's essentially computational analysis. And so I think it's outside the charter.
James.
Is this working? Yeah. So just to kind of continue what Sonia was saying there, I think we've heard kind of two viewpoints in the sense of these are preferences and they can be ignored, and yet it's necessary to have this category because it's contained within the EU law and needs to be, and it's broad and needs to be defined. And I think my concern is that it assumes, if we are going to say that this category exists but components of it can be ignored, but we're not going to define what those components are, that pushes on to regulators and others to make it clear that what those exceptions are. Let's assume for a second that these types of categories will have some legal basis in the future, and I'm not as confident that this group is not better placed to try and have that thought process rather than regulators and expecting them to say, well, yes, this you have to follow this TDM category, but we recognize and will regulate that there's an exception for research in this particular way or for this particular use case. And also, I think that the expectations that are going to be set for people using these categories are going to be misaligned with what they mean. If we go down the route of saying, well, we have this category, but we have an expectation that some of this might be ignored in certain circumstances. And we just don't know what their preferences are. In some cases, it may be that they literally do not want to have AI used and are comfortable with the unintended consequences of being completely shut out from lots of online services. Or it might be that they are truly unintended consequences, but they don't understand what they're signing up for when they specify that preference. So my view is that it should be something that we define more carefully and closely, rather than saying we have this broad category and yes, there's unintended consequences, but we can just ignore them when they occur.
So TDM is a legal framework, which means kind of if you want to use a certain set of data, you have to go and talk to your lawyer and figure out if you're allowed to use it. I don't think that's something that is useful to put in a machine readable document where then a machine can, based on some simple rules, decide if it's possible to use it or not. And that's what we're talking about here. So I don't think that we have to cover this, and I don't think there's a one-to-one mapping, because at the end you have to talk to your lawyers and not just have a robot deciding.
So the discussion right now is focusing specifically on TDM. But the more general question is also a top-level job category, and I want to make sure we touch on that as well. So next up is Kevin.
To Miriam's point, I don't think we're suggesting that any of these examples are part of the standard. Are we? Am I misunderstanding other people's intention there?
Which example?
In 3.2.
The
whole point is that the standard is a method for expressing preference signals. What you do with that preference signal is outside the scope of the standard. If I'm understanding what our
No, but I mean, did you express the preference signal order for automatic processing by what? By
Miriam, you're not on the mic. It can't be you.
My assumption was at least you're expressing a signal in order to have an automated processing of the signal that can be used by crawler or by some kind of machine that creates a model or whatever, right? So there's an automatic processing that wants to interpret it. I'm saying that we might create a signal here that cannot be automated processed. You always have to look at it one-on-one. And just by having a signal doesn't change the legal framework around it. So you have to do this with or without the signal. So the signal is not useful.
I'm not sure that I follow. Surely the signal is an input into that larger decision making process.
If somebody has a right to use certain data, or somebody else has a right to forbid you to use certain data, that is a question of rights. That's independent if you said, I wish you would not use it, right? So even if I say I wish you would not use it, you still have to figure out if you're allowed to use it or not.
All of that is acknowledged in the current draft, right? Like it says it may give rise to legal rights and obligation. It informs consumers of the preferences, of the fact that they are responsible for understanding any legal obligations that may arise from these things. So we are trying to deal with these complexities. Just restating these complexities doesn't solve them from being an issue here.
So the point is, we are designing something that can be read by an automated script, whatever, right? And that script will have some usually kind of simple rules to either decide to follow the preference or to not follow the preference. But if there is no simple rule, if you always have to go on a case-by-case basis anyway, then it's not useful to put a machine-readable signal anywhere. That's my point.
And let's abolish this working rule. Yeah. Like, I mean, that's a consequence of your argument. Like, if you say that machine-readable signals are provide no value whatsoever because you need to check, then like, what are we doing here?
No, so that's what I'm saying. That this is a legal framework. You still have to check the legal framework. Of course, you can still be nice and adhere to somebody's preference, but like the use cases I've heard are around AI and generative AI and not as broad as we're discussing here.
Okay, so let's try to get back to the.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think first, just like a level set, I've heard people say TDM a bunch of times, but the current text is automated processing. And so like, I think most people think we're changing back to TDM. I think it'd be helpful to say automated processing because it's quite confusing to have the two terms be like, I'm not expressing an opinion on what it should say. I'm just saying, let's try to be consistent with the draft. Because I think TDM, I think as far as just noting, kind of brings in a bunch of other context, right?
Actually, to clarify, I was talking about TDM.
Okay. So yeah, it's great. So like, I think if we may need an issue for like, are we turning it back to TDM? And again, I'm not expressing an opinion. I'm just like, let's narrow this down. And I think so. My sense is some people think it should be TDM. So
what we started talking about was, should we have this top level preference, whether it's automated processing, TDM, food.
Yeah, just saying, let's,
Sure,
great.
My whole discussion was reacting to Paul saying we have to cover the legal framework of TDM in some way, and this might be a category called automated processing. I think we don't have to cover it. That was my point.
Thank you. Second, I want to circle back to like the bunch of stuff that's been on this chat, I think about the implications, 3.2, and I think Aaron may want to make in a second. Like, just as level setting, all IETF standards are course voluntary in some sense. And I think Aaron made the point on the chat that that nevertheless, if you like don't follow like robust test, they'll think you're a jerk. If I'm reading the implication properly, the implication is of what she's saying is that no matter what stuff we say in 3.2 about how maybe you don't have to follow it, if you don't follow it, you're going to think you're a jerk. So like all the weaseling, whatever weaseling we put into 3.2 doesn't really help against that setting. And similarly, and now I'll say from my position that I think we're going to see regulatory requirements that will impose this, and the weaseling also will not help in against regulatory requirements. Because people will just say like, regardless of whatever 3.2 says, you have to follow this, right? So I think so Aaron, I don't know if you want to clarify whether you think 3.2 is anything useful or not, but
yeah, before Erin goes, I want to say something to interject a little bit. You can pass the mic to her, but 3.2 didn't exist in the last version of the draft. Okay, so 3.2 was added because people said like, hey, like if you don't have this list of things, people would be like bamboozled into following preferences they may not have to follow.
No, but there already was text saying it was all optional. That's the part
that is correct, but the list was not added.
I agree.
So like,
I don't think the list actually matters for the purpose of my
correct. So I think like, you know, if you want to take it out, I think we can have a discussion about that. But I just wanted to mention that this didn't exist. So like we should not be looping on things. But I think it's like I agree with you, Ekar, right? Like that, like, you know, the list doesn't matter to me personally, right? Like, because I don't think it makes a difference. But like it was added because some people strongly felt that this like biases the thing too much towards content holders. Like it's mostly like people from civil society who are mentioning like, hey, like, you know, this says like, oh, like, you know, you need to follow that. So I think that's the balance in the working group that like, so because like somebody else is going to complain if the thing gets taken out is my point, right? Because I think that's what we need to walk.
Can I just have the mic for a second? So again, I'm not advocating for or against 3.2 in this moment. I'm merely saying that I think what I hear being said by some people is that no disclaimers you put in there will be effective against people feeling the need to have to apply the specification.
Here's what I'm going to say.
Please.
This debate is not actually about 3.2, right? 3.2 is helpful as far as it goes, but it is not going to make the difference one way or the other. If somebody has a legal right to do something, that they do. If somebody has a legal obligation to do something, like 3.2, I think is boilerplate has a negative connotation, but it's scene setting, right? The real debate here is about the high-level processing category. And the reason I think some of us are objecting to 3.2 in that context is that we've heard it said that 3.2 is the safety release valve that justifies having a super broad high-level processing category that is actually too broad for most purposes. And that's where I object. I think that we need to be more focused on the particular uses that we want to enable preferences about and not have to resort to a laundry list of exceptions or some sort of prefatory language about, well, maybe you don't actually have to follow this at all.
I think if you want to respond, I said go for it.
Yeah, I have a request for Aaron. Send text. One of the biggest problems I've had with this group is that there's a lot of criticism, but not a lot of offering of a way forward. And I know it's very difficult, and it's probably the hardest one for any of us to solve here. But what we're looking for is for someone to give us an alternative. And we've tried to do exactly what you've described. And part of the problem with this, and the reason that we have a system that uses preferences and not controls, and a system that has all these exceptions in it, is because we cannot anticipate those exceptional circumstances.
Yeah, so I did put a pitch on the mailing list. I haven't put it in the GitHub because I kind of wanted to get here to take people's temperature because if it's a non-starter, it's a non-starter. But
Happy to.
Yeah, I'm a bit out of date. I've been traveling.
Funny that. And I'll interject after your interjection. I think, part of the problem is that, the fundamental issue is, do we need a top level a category or not? And to me, it harks back to the previous discussion of, well, what does it really mean to have a preference for don't use my content with AI at all, when AI is, in some people's minds, a building block technique. It's just, it's just a piece of technology. It's not anything purpose-related necessarily. Next we have Michael. Oh, let's see if this one works.
No, I'll pass you on.
No, Mike.
Really, it was just a few quick notes. Personally, I'm not that pessimistic on the overarching category. I think if you'd asked a lot of the content creators, but we can ask them and hopefully get their opinion, they wouldn't be too against it because they do want to avoid, other use cases that they hadn't previously considered to sort of creep in. And the last thing I was going to say, I don't get the point about automated systems not being able to make a decision. This is not an AI system making a decision. This is a programmer implementing logic and then deciding if given piece of content can be used by a model or other processes. So I just wanted to say that didn't make a lot of sense too. That was it.
Okay. Empty?
Oh, I already said that.
You've said a piece. Okay, great. Max.
Yeah, I just want to respond to something MT said around the of a useful suggestion and what do we actually do. And part of the issue from my perspective is I don't think it's solvable in the vocabulary document, and we're obviously focused a lot on the vocabulary document today as that's what we were scheduled to talk about. But to preview something that I plan on saying later in the week is I think that these are issues that can be handled in the attachments document, particularly with pointers to other things that are not standardizable. And I think that it might be a bit of a rabbit hole to try to figure out how to shove everything into a vocabulary document that's standardized, as opposed to saying there are some things that are not necessarily standardizable, and while we can't standardize them here, we can point to where they exist, and maybe that is a useful way to get ourselves out of this pickle.
Unmute.
Max, so you brought that up a couple of times. I think if folks are interested, it'd be great to hear about that in that approach. But when we start talking about making it specific to attachment mechanisms, we have to look at the charter scope and figure out if we can do that. So if folks are interested, let's hear about that. Shrish.
Yeah, thanks. So Erin, to go back to your point, right? As a chair, my concern is that we are cycling between two things. So as long as you make progress in one direction, it's fine. But now you're cycling back. So let me try to rephrase what I understood as a concern for having the catch-all, right? People say I want to have some things I'm pretty sure I'm willing to give permission for, but I'm not going to give permission for unknown uses of things that I don't know, right? So the way people mentioned they would do that is turning off some top level category and granting specific permissions for things, right? And so whatever proposal you want to make, right, kind of has to make sure that somebody can do that, right? They want to, so if you have a bunch of specific things, right, they'll state that, but what happens for the things that you don't know about today, right? And I think that's kind of where the concern came from, that we had to have a overarching category where the thing kind of goes into default deny or default allow. I think Miria's concern is default deny, closest of the web, right? But could also be default allow that goes in there and then do whatever. So I don't think this, our working group is gonna go on one default or another on the top level thing. But I think whatever you suggest needs to address that thing where somebody is not gonna give same way that we are talking about damage being oh, we are unnecessarily broadly blocking off things, right? But it should also address how somebody can unnecessarily not grant things they don't want to.
I think that's begging the question a bit, and I don't necessarily agree that we do need to do that. There is already a capability to block crawlers from accessing a resource. And so if you object to any and all use of your content, that's a way to do it that exists currently. And I think that having a high-level automated processing category is simply too broad as an alternative to kind of define a space that we're trying to carve up in a useful way.
So you channel Leonard here?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. If I'm not sure Leonard's still with us, but if he were, he'd point out that this is not just for talking about the people who have use cases, but it's vocabulary. And so maybe that's part of the disconnect. Bradley.
Yeah, so, I think having that category would be extremely useful, but not having that category would mean that we would figure out a way to say it somewhere else, right? So that's what would ultimately happen. And then it becomes a question of looking in more than one place for something that is important to know about, right? So there is a strong convenience argument, there is a strong efficiency argument, there's a strong argument that it would reduce legal risk to make sure you don't miss anything, to have it all in one place. But, there is already a legal regime in, at least one major jurisdiction that recognizes the importance of being able to specify your preference relating to a type of activity, and whether the group decides to put that in the list or not, that still exists. So I think I'm being quiet, even though, in the meeting in London, I was very verbal about this has to be there because, it exists, and it would be such a glaring, obvious, exclusion not to have it there, because all the other things that follow from that are exactly of the same type of thing that you would put in that list, and you're sort of taking out the one that was really, is kind of like there in black and white. So, at this point, it seems to me that it would be a mistake not to include it, but ultimately, as a, content, rights person, you'd figure out somewhere else to put it. It just wouldn't be the most efficient result.
We're almost at time, so I'm going to look at you, and we're going to just have one wrap up before we go, but we'll drink you first. So Amelia, and then more. Oh, yeah, maybe I need to.
So I think the main reason at this point why we have this category is because some or we or whoever wanted a hierarchy. And if you have a hierarchy, you need this top level category. But as Martin said no, so maybe you want to answer my next. And I think the difference between having a hierarchy and not having a hierarchy is that with a hierarchy, you try to cover the whole space. So you can always move to one category up and you cover everything that comes up new, and you already have like some kind of preference that will include this new thing by default. If you not having a hierarchy, you kind of one by one go for every use case. And I think actually, given how fast the space is moving, I think that is a better approach. But I just wanted to point out, I think this is the difference.
Which is that? Can I explain what?
The space rather than blanket it.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. This is kind of tying in the hierarchy question as well, which people thought as well. So I think we'll oh, sorry, Martin, you have a.
Cut me off again. No, I want to text to Miriam. You won't need it back. So,
Then I put it on.
So I think the question for me goes back to the question that Eka raised earlier, which is, do we as a group believe that we should be allowing people to express this particular preference? I think that's really what it comes down to. And that's the question I think I'd ask of anyone who objects to this one. I can understand how you might object to it being forced by legislation to adhere to something like this, but would you object to someone being able to express that preference is one question. I don't, to the second point, Miriam's point here, tiling the space is only possible if you know what the space looks like, and we don't know what the space looks like, which is why we went for the hierarchy in the first place. We don't know what potential things might fall under this top level category. So, and we've heard from people that they would like to be able to say things. So that's where it came from. That's where it came from. But I think ultimately the question for me is, do we want to be able to allow people to express a preference about this particular thing? Even though, yes, I agree, it is quite broad.
The point is, tiling the space is not possible because you don't know the space without a hierarchy. But the question is, do we need to cover the full space, or is it okay to just cover those cases right now that we know about? That I think that is the question.
Yes, yes, it is.
And a quick question: so if we would decide this automated processing category is not useful, how would you realize the hierarchy without that?
So a hierarchy can exist at different layers, at different levels. We can have a hierarchy under AI training, for instance, which we already do, funnily enough. And that exists because, well, it currently exists because we have the understanding that there are types of AI training that are not generative, that people might want to exclude or include according to their preferences. And there are things that they don't know about that fall into that category. There are unknown things under the higher level one that they might want to say, you know what, I don't understand them, I don't know about them, therefore, no. Or yes, as it happens, because we have the preferences cut both ways.
So basically, are you saying that you would have a set of, AI training and another distinct set, and each of them could have a hierarchy, but there's no common top level?
The structure of the draft right now allows for any categories to be a super category of a more narrowly scoped definition at some point in the future. That has always been the way that it is. And if you were to suggest that we are tiling the space and looking for a single flat hierarchy of things, then we are making a deliberate choice to exclude any unknown things in that definition.
Yeah.
Right? That would be a deliberate choice.
Yeah.
And
That's a choice I think we need to make.
yeah.
Yeah, and for me, it goes back to the previous discussion just a little bit, in that if we're doing something that is bigger than just AI, because the search shape, that changes this a little bit too, because you say all the things, but it's not all the things, because it doesn't include a web browser rendering to a human, and you have to define that shape somehow.
Yeah, I think the big questions for me about this one is, are people wanting to express this particular preference, and are we going to give them that, or are we going to deny them that? And are people going to want to be able to express a preference about unknown things within these categories, and are we going to give them the right to say something about that or take that away from them?
Right, and it's within these categories. That's the
within these categories.
Yes, yeah, that's the point.
So I took it off again. Sorry.
I don't think it's only like, you frame it, you probably don't mean it, you frame it a little bit too absolute, which is not about if we were in a position to allow that or not allow within this vocabulary. I think the point that Bradley made is we don't have any agency allowing or disallowing anybody to express any preferences, and the purpose of this group was to find, especially of the vocabulary again, was to find a shared vocabulary, designing things that only work on themselves, knowing that there's other things that they don't, that at some point, then let's just put everything into the attachment draft and not pretend that we want to be compatible with, that this is intended as a mechanism for finding a shared vocabulary.
So we're about at time. Let's end the day by taking one more pair of polls. I have a feeling I know what's going to tell us, but hey, let's go. I'm suggesting the polls will be: can you live with shipping a vocabulary that includes a top-level category? And then, can you live with shipping a vocabulary that excludes a top-level category? Is that clear?
No. Define can you live?
Well, that's a little bit of a IETF.
So is it now about the top level category or about automated processing?
It's about a top level category, not a specific proposal, just conceptually.
And can you restate the question again?
Well, I'll put it in the thing.
Oh, great. Restate the question.
Can you live with, which is not, you know, do you prefer, it's, can you live with? Leave me alone. One more cocktail you owe me. Can you live with shipping a vocabulary that includes a top level preference? And that's employing hierarchy, that's Mary was saying. And then the next one will be, instead of including, excluding. So we kind of get both sides. Are you ready? Here we go.
Arranged marriage. I don't know how the husband looks. So these options are just like arranged marriages, you know.
Welcome to the IETF.
You know, it's gonna be better.
Yeah, I did say I was looking forward to this one. So just 30 more seconds.
No, let him go, Mark. So there's 40 people. So the standard here with a can you live with is that you're willing to tell us why. Right. And so we don't have.
But maybe tomorrow.
Our point. Remember your votes because we're going to talk more about this tomorrow. The discussion will continue until consensus improves. Okay, I'm going to cut this off in just a moment. So 17-4 saying that they can live with it. 8 saying they cannot. So tomorrow 9 saying they cannot. Tomorrow 10 saying they cannot. I'm going to pause here for a second. 18, 11, 3. That's getting close to 50-50. Okay, I'm going to close it. And then we're going to do the inverse.
64.
But I mean, it's not meaning.
I think this is going to be a similar split. We'll see. One more vote and you can go home.
For some definition of home.
Yeah. Temporary.
Not here.
You don't have to go home, but you can't see it there.
That's the answer is not direct reciprocal. You know, this is common, actually.
This is common
in these scenarios.
Yeah.
Because you're testing for objection.
The yes is not very meaningful at the end.
It's not a vote.
No, this is not a vote, to be clear. This is just gathering information.
It is a vote.
But it's not.
Okay, 30 more seconds. Less input on this one. Please get in here if you haven't already.
Well, I already said something to my first
Okay, just about to close it. Okay, well that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see, down the bottom.
Who's the person that didn't vote in the second vote?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. We lost one participant along the way. So there's a little less objection to excluding it, but I don't think that's a strong number of information. Yeah, that's the number of people on the call. That's what it is. So I guess we'll continue this tomorrow. We'll have some other discussions as well.
Yeah, so the way I see it is, right, like let's start with the assumption that we don't have it and then like go the objections, right, to that and see if it's doesn't sway anybody's mind.
Let's start with the objection that we don't have consensus. Yeah. We can always start with the position that we don't have consensus.
Yeah, but I'm not like. I mean, these are bad numbers, right?
Right, these are not useful numbers,
Yeah.
definitely.
I think like assuming that the presumption is we're not. I mean, I voted yes on this, but I think assuming the presumption we're going to have the yes on the second one, and that people have to defend themselves only on that one is like not reasonable. But I think on both cases, we should ask for real
Yeah,
arguments here.
of course. This is just confirming that we have a lot of work to do, basically. All right.
It would be interesting to rerun the mornings ones. Like, do we think we're getting some?
You are. You want me to call these people in this room longer?
There's some value tomorrow.
Okay, tomorrow. All right, well, let's end today. Let's go out and have some chats over dinner and drinks, hopefully. See if we can make a little progress.
Are you inviting us to some dinner somewhere? No. Are you at least gonna pick a restaurant so that we'll go there?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, you said.
Usually we self-arrange these things.
We should just
find groups of people who are not like you, ideally, and figure out
I
restaurants.
don't know if they want to hang out.
I think everybody's different from bars.
Yeah, you're wording of find somebody who's not here.
Yeah.
All right, so 9 for 9:15 tomorrow morning. Thank you all. Thanks to Rural Pieces for sticking up with us.
Thanks all.
Whoever doesn't like him, let's have